Hey guys, today we're going to begin talking about Sherman Alexie and the Native American and oral literary traditions. We're going to be reading Thomas Builds the Fire, and that is a short story from the longer collection, The Lone Ranger and Tonto Fist Fight in Heavens. This is an award-winning collection written by Sherman Alexie. So I want to begin by talking about the oral literary tradition and the effect that oral literary tradition has had on contemporary Native American writing. So, as you already know, when Europeans first came to the New World, there were already people living here. It is believed that there were about 300 cultural groups speaking somewhere around 500 languages. In the course of a few centuries, those languages dwindled down to about 200, and even those 200, many of those languages are incomplete. So much of that culture has been lost. So, like many cultures, the Native Americans told creation stories, they told hero stories, they used oral stories for ceremony and ritual, and they also used oral stories to tell the history of their tribes. And this oral literary tradition, this rich oral literary tradition, is reflected in the contemporary literature of Native Americans today. So how did Western literature and the Western literary tradition affect the oral literary tradition that was common among Native Americans? A couple of things we need to talk about. One, most Native American tribes, while they may have used pictograms or pictographs, were almost exclusively oral. Two, introducing writing into these native cultures had both positive and negative effects. The positive is that we can preserve stories. Stories don't get lost if we write them down. The other positive is that we can share these stories with other cultures. So Native Americans were able to share their stories with Western culture. It's also important to note, however, that many Western cultures worked to eliminate native languages and native stories. For example, in the United States in the 1800s and early 20th century, early 1900s, there was this program called Kill the Savage, Save the Man. Basically, what happened is that agents of the US government went on to Native American reservations and removed children from their families and sent them to boarding schools. Often, this was a necessary condition for those reservations to keep receiving government assistance. So first, they're forced onto reservations. Often reservations are on really low quality land, so you can't really grow a lot. And so that meant that many Native Americans were dependent on US support. And so many US government agents said, if you don't give us your children, we won't give you food or money or whatever it is that they had already promised. So they take these children and they send them into boarding schools. Most of these boarding schools were run by the Catholic Church, and they were filled with abuse. The children had their hair cut. They had their names changed to more commonly Western names. They were not allowed to speak their native language. They were not allowed to practice their native faith. There are stories of horrible physical abuse and even sexual abuse. And then when these children became adults, the idea was that they were supposed to be returned to the reservation. And so they went back home, many of them not speaking the native language. And so there's this huge, what we call the lost generation. So they go home to speak to their parents or their grandparents, and they can't communicate with each other. They don't have the same culture anymore. And so there's a lot lost here in terms of language and in terms of story and in terms of culture. Some interesting aspects of oral literature. One is the sort of communal aspect of it. Oral tales are considered communal property, meaning that anybody can tell a story, anybody can actually change a story a little bit if they don't like it, so everybody has sort of authorship rights to the story. And then this kind of reflects the communal aspect of most Native American cultures. Our modern Western culture is very much an sort of army of one kind of culture. We celebrate the individual in many ways. Western culture has always been fond of the hero tale, for instance, the one individual overcoming hardship, etc. Whereas many Native American stories are told for communal purposes, passing down history, relating moral advice, that kind of thing. The other aspect or interesting aspect of oral literature is that the audience is often considered a part of the story. Their reaction to the tale might actually change the story, right? So if you're telling a story and the audience is reacting negatively to a particular character, and that character is supposed to have a happy ending, you as author might change that happy ending to meet the audience's expectations. This is a dialectical form of storytelling. Okay, so this will definitely be on the exam. Native American cultures use stories for many different reasons. They used it to convey practical information about the natural world and to teach moral lessons. Native American tales often reflect a more inclusive, ecocentric view of the world, in which humans live in harmony with nature, or if a human for some reason doesn't live in harmony with nature, that's sort of like a teaching tale. This is something that happens, something negative happens to that character because they're unable to live in harmony with nature. Um, there's often a lot of metaphor. So if you've already read Thomas Builds the Fire, you may have been confused by the constant references to ponies. We'll come back to that here in a little bit. The trickster is a very common archetype. We see him all over, even in Western culture, but he's especially prominent in Native American oral tales as well. Repetition, right? Repetition is common in all kinds of oral tales, folk tales, fairy tales, oral tales told by Native Americans, because repetition helps the storyteller remember, and it also helps the listener remember. In Sherman Alexie's tales, you'll also see lots of things like flashbacks, historical references, time shifts, reoccurring characters. So if you're reading through like a collection of short stories, you might meet a character who is actually very prominent in other Native American tales, and then alternating narrators. Some things to know about Sherman Alexie. He was born in Wellpinit, Washington on the Spokane Indian Reservation in 1966, and he's still alive. He was born with hydrocephalus, which is like water on the brain, and he was not expected to live. Despite this sort of brain injury, he learned how to read at a very young age. He started reading when he was like 3 years old, and in many ways, he's sort of like a reading prodigy. Because of his medical issues, like for instance, because of the water on the brain, his head was actually a little bit bigger than his body. And so he was often ostracized by other children. Not just that, but also his intelligence. His desire to read books by white authors, for instance, made him seem like a cultural outsider. And so he knew what it was to be ostracized and bullied. He does decide to leave school when he's a young child. So he's about 11 or 12 years old when he starts going to school off the reservation. And when he goes to school off the reservation, he's actually the only Indian there. So on the reservation, he's an outsider, and off the reservation, he's an outsider. And this idea of being the other or being the outsider is often reflected in the literature that he writes. After high school, Sherman Alexie will go to college, but he dropped out after a couple of years because he struggled with alcoholism. And the struggle with alcoholism, especially as it relates to Native Americans, is another very common theme that you'll find in his literature. He will eventually go back to college. He'll go to Washington State and will eventually graduate with a bachelor's degree in American Studies. Since he's graduated, he's become sort of an award-winning like poet, novelist, songwriter, screenwriter. He's helped to create films, and he's become sort of in many ways, I don't want to call him a token, but in many ways, if you're going to get a Native American text on your syllabus, it's almost always by Sherman Alexie. So I guess that kind of does make him a token. It's also important to note that just recently during the Me Too movement, Sherman Alexie was kind of caught up in that. While there's no evidence that he assaulted anybody, there is some evidence that he engaged in inappropriate kind of behavior using his influence to gain sexual favors from female writers in the Native American community. So some common themes I already mentioned, themes like alcoholism, race, or the story of the outsider. Education will be a common theme in his text. Certainly the idea like identity, who am I, where do I fit in, home, tradition. The concept of writing or storytelling is also a very common theme in his work. So be looking for some of these themes as you read Thomas Builds the Fire if you haven't read it already. Okay, the last thing I want to talk about before we start talking about the story itself is the fact that not only is this a great example of Native American storytelling that's been influenced by this oral tradition, this is also a postmodern text. So on the right side of the screen, you will see those characteristics of postmodern literature that you should already have in your notebook: questionable narrators, nonlinear plots, metafiction, historiographic metafiction, intertextuality, pastiche, technoculture, hyporeality, irony, playfulness, and black humor. You're definitely going to get some of these in this text. Specifically, you'll see a lot of pastiche, and we're going to talk about how that plays out in the story. So if you haven't read, go ahead and read Sherman Alexie's Thomas Builds the Fire and meet me back for the first half of that lecture.